Hi, I'm Gregg LeFevre, creator and host of the Compulsive Storyteller Podcast. Welcome to another segment of Pass the Mic, where we invite talented guests, artists, writers, actors, musicians, and others to join us on the pod to tell a great story and or to chat with me about the art of storytelling. I'm very excited to introduce today's guest, Rory O'Connor. Rory O'Connor is an award-winning author, journalist, and filmmaker. He has played a key role as a director, writer, producer, and executive producer in the creation of more than 30 documentaries, and his programming has aired in leading networks in more than 100 countries. In addition to co-creating and managing 2 internationally distributed weekly news magazines, South Africa Now and Rights and Wrongs, Human Rights Television, O'Connor also ran the domestic syndicated series ABC Children First. He is also the author of 3 books on the media: Shock Jocks, Hate Speech and Talk Radio, Nuke Speak, The Settling of Nuclear Technology from the Manhattan Project to Fukushima, and Friends, Followers, and the Future, How Social Media Are Challenging Politics, Threatening Big Brands, and Killing Traditional Media. O'Connor's broadcast, film, and print work has been recognized with a George Polk Award, a Writers Guild Award, a George Orwell Award, and 2 Emmys, among many other honors. Hey, Rory. Welcome to Pass the Mic. You've had a fascinating career, and so you have a story to tell us. Does it have a title?
Well, let's call it word processor, because that's what I've been doing for decades now.
Okay, that sounds good. Word processor. So do you want to set the stage or just jump right in?
Yeah, well, let's jump right in. So back in the last century, I actually started my career as a word processor, as a poet. I was writing and selling poetry. I was teaching poetry at my alma mater, Boston College, and I was performing sort of an early version of performance artist, along with my then roommate, a fellow named Tony Taccone, who later went on to great fame as the director of the renowned Berkeley Rep Theater out in Berkeley, California. And along the way, I was also starving. So I had managed to sell a poem to a weekly newspaper called the Boston Phoenix, which is now defunct, along with most other newspapers that I've written for over the years. And I received the grand total of $10 for that. So I found out that the Phoenix actually paid $75 if you were to write something called an article instead. So in short order, I began writing as many articles as I possibly could. Unfortunately, they paid $75, as I mentioned, so even though I was churning them out at an unbelievable pace, I was still forced to work as a cab driver. And so I spent almost 3 years freelance writing as furiously as I possibly could, driving a cab every day from 3 p.m. to midnight in the Boston area. Red Cab, give it a shout out. Became a member of the Teamsters Union, of course, which was mandatory, and which basically meant I just had to give a cut of my salary that I made as a cab driver to them. And I was trying pretty desperately to get a job, unsuccessfully, as I said, for almost 3 years. At one point, I actually was ready to abandon ship and become a lawyer, and I was enrolled in law school. But at the last minute, I decided I just couldn't go that route. And I think it was at that moment, deciding that I was all in on journalism, which was my new chosen career, that things began to change for me. And in short order, I was hired by a rival to the Boston Phoenix called the Real Paper out of Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I started out working as a news editor there and writing about 5,000 words every week, feature articles about many different topics, investigative journalism, and eventually became the news editor. unfortunately, the real paper, which had started as a collective, had come to, uh, I guess, a route that most collectives do, which is split in half. The publisher took up with the vice publisher's wife, and the staff split into two factions. So, as a result of this, the real paper was then sold. And it was sold to a consortium, oddly enough, of Republicans, including David Rockefeller Jr. And the editor was a man named Martin Linsky. You may have heard of his son, Max, who actually has become quite famous in the podcasting world himself since then. But Marty Linsky, as I said, was a Republican. He had run for lieutenant governor, in fact, of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts unsuccessfully. And so a friend of his named Ralph Fine, who was the primary investor in the real paper, decided to kind of bail him out because he needed a job and made him the editor of the newspaper. And Marty and David Rockefeller and Ralph Fine and I really didn't see things, let's say, politically from the same vantage point. So we began butting heads. And the thing that the real paper was most famous for, in fact, was not its news or its investigative journalism. It was for its music writing. Many of the top rock critics, as they were then known, began at the real paper. People like John Landau, who went on to become the manager of Bruce Springsteen. Dave Marsh went on to become the editor at Rolling Stone, and many, many others, too many to go into right now. Anyway, one day, I think Marsh had just resigned and moved to New York to work at Rolling Stone. So the editor, Martin Linsky, came to me and said, "You know anything about music?" And I said, "Of course, I listen to it every day." And I realized that he was offering me an out, that if I became the music editor, I thought I could get out of his line of sight and we wouldn't bang heads. And I knew that if I continued being the news editor, it was going to end badly. So, in short order, I went from being an investigative journalist and a news writer to being a rock critic. And I wrote a weekly column called Local Color about all the local music scene there. Boston was very much a hotbed in those days of all sorts of music, folk music, people like James and Livingston Taylor, rock music, the great Jonathan Richman, the Cars, many, many other groups that I won't go into now. But it was very fertile ground. And also I should mention, by the way, that the leading advertiser in the real paper and in the Boston Phoenix, for that matter, was the local music promoter, Don Law. Don Law basically controlled much, if not almost all, of the music concerts and clubs in not only the Boston area, but throughout New England. And as I say, he was the largest advertiser. Now, one day, a local band leader from one of the local rock groups called me up and he said, "We are being prevented from playing in any clubs that are not controlled by Don Law, not by his competitors. And, we can't survive that way. Can't you? You write a weekly column about the music scene, you have to write about this." So I did a little investigating and I found out, sure enough, Don Law was prohibiting rock bands from playing in clubs that were owned by his competitors. So I wrote a column saying that. And the next day, Don Law called up the publisher Ralph Fine and editor Martin Linsky and said, "I'm pulling all of my advertising unless and until you fire Rory O'Connor." So, despite the fact that I had made that lateral move to become a rock critic in order to stay out of the line of fire, I ended up being fired for doing journalism nonetheless. And long story short, I had been also helping to organize a union at the real paper in those days. So when Mr. Linsky said that he was firing me, I sat down with him and I said, "Look, Marty, it's a bad idea. Let me give you some free advice. It's a bad idea to fire one of the union organizers in the middle of a union drive. The rest of the workers here are not going to take this well." Uh, and Marty did not take my comment well and told me to not to threaten him. And I said, "I'm not threatening you. I'm trying to do you a favor, but okay, you're firing me. I'll go." The rest of the staff then promptly and quite predictably went on strike until Linsky and Fine were forced to rehire me as the rock critic. But it was an untenable situation. I stayed for several more months just because all my coworkers had stood up for me. And then I resigned and I went back to freelance writing, and I began writing for a lot of magazines such as Boston Magazine and Atlantic Monthly, as it was then known, Rolling Stone, many others. And just to wrap up this part of the story, about well, as I say, the union started at the real paper. There was no union at its competitor, the Boston Phoenix, and as a result, the real paper was put in a very disadvantageous situation vis-a-vis its main competition. That is to say, they were losing money hand over fist. And so after about 6 months, they went to my former colleague, Mark Zanger, and they said, "Will you please come in and edit the newspaper and save us?" Sort of a classic example of what's known as lemon socialism, which is where the owners destroy the company and then let the workers take it over. Mark said, "Well, I'll only do this under one circumstance, and that's if you let me hire Rory O'Connor as the managing editor." So 6 months after being fired as the rock critic for writing a true story about the violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act by the major advertiser, Don Law, I was back as the managing editor of the newspaper. And I remained the managing editor of the paper until it was sold to the Boston Phoenix and went out of business. So that was the end of my career at a real paper, and it was also the end of the real paper. And I started seeing the handwriting on the wall. I guess if I could get credit for anything, it was seeing that print was endangered, even in those early days. And I thought, well, poetry didn't work out so well, and this writing thing isn't working out too well either. I better find something else to do fast, or I'm going to be back driving a taxi cab in short order. So I had journalism experience, and I thought, well, maybe I can parlay that into television journalism, even though I had never done any television whatsoever. A woman that I knew, who was a good friend and a fan of mine, was then the managing editor of a nightly news magazine at the ABC television affiliate in Boston, WCVB. And I contacted her and I said, "Look, Judy, I'm getting desperate here. I don't know television, but I'm sure I could learn. Do you have anything for me?" She said, "Well, no, I don't have anything now, but call me every month. I mean it." So I called her every month, just as she had suggested, for 5 or 6 months. Nothing happened. I was getting increasingly desperate. And then one day, Judy called me out of the blue and said, "One of my producers just quit right in the middle of a story. Can you pick up for her?" And I said, "Absolutely," even though I had no idea what I was doing. I said, "What is the story you want me to do?" And she said, "I want you to fly to Burlington, Vermont tomorrow and do a story on the Red Mayor." Now, I had no idea what she was talking about, but I did some quick research and I found out that what she was referring to was a rather cantankerous fellow from Brooklyn, a Jewish guy by the name of Bernie Sanders, who had just been amazingly elected the mayor of Burlington, Vermont, because the Democratic Party and the Republican Party both were at odds with one another, and he managed to sneak in as an independent candidate, winning election by 10 votes. So the first television story that I ever did was a profile of Bernie Sanders, and I guess you could say the rest, at least as far as Bernie is concerned, is history. And I just parenthetically end by saying I looked at that interview again just the other day, and Bernie is pretty much saying almost exactly word for word the same things that he said to me back in the early 80s in that first interview that I ever did for television. So, anyway, in short order, I became a television journalist. I was doing 2 stories a week uh, from start to finish, research, setup, shooting, writing, editing, and producing and putting them on air. And I was actually making a pretty good living for the first time because I was getting paid by the piece. Uh, Unfortunately, I was so prolific that they came to me and they said, "Well, we want to hire you now." And I said, "Great." So I finally had gotten another job in journalism. That was the good news. The bad news was that as an employee, I was going to make about half as much money as I had been making as a freelancer because I was doing so many pieces. So I said, "Well, no, I don't want a job. Let me stay as a freelancer." And they said, "No, it's either take the job or leave." So I took the job, and that was really the beginning of my television journalism career. And along with writing, that's something that I've been doing ever since and continue to do to this day.
Cool. Let me just ask one or two quick questions as a sort of a closer. In the interest of transparency, Rory and I have known each other for, I don't know, 50 years. And when we first met, he was doing a program called South Africa Today, which I very much admired. And seems like it was the only voice of the anti-apartheid movement in America. And after, when Mandela was released, if I remember correctly, Rory, when Mandela landed, I think you told me that Yasser Arafat had arranged to land in a similar jet. When Mandela came out on the top of the stairs of his jet, Yasser Arafat ran across the tarmac and up the stairs. And so the first picture of Mandela was being hugged by Yasser Arafat. Is that a correct memory?
Well, I'm not certain it was the first picture, but I can tell you with certitude that the Palestinian cause was one that was always supported by the African National Congress, Nelson Mandela's organization, uh, right from the very start. And Mandela would constantly mention the Palestinian cause and say that none of us could be free until the Palestinians are free. So again, history has this funny way of being circular. Here we are once more again in exactly that same situation. And, people criticize Mandela, but he was steadfast in his support, not for terrorism, of course, but for the Palestinian people and for their right to self determination and to have their own country.
Great. Well, listen, thank you so much for coming on. And is there one final thing you'd like to plug that my listeners can listen to or go for?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for asking. So, one of the things that I'm working on right now is a weekly PBS program called Laura Flanders and Friends. And it's kind of back to the future for me in that it's an independent, not for profit, small, and struggling outfit. But we managed once again to get it on hundreds of public television stations here in America. Laura is someone I've known and worked with for many, many years. She's a brilliant journalist, and we're about to start our new season in a week on all the national PBS programs. As they say, can consult your local listings. I'm very excited about the first show because we just spent the last 2 weeks on the road with Bernie Sanders and AOC. So check it out, Laura Flanders and Friends.
Great. Well, Rory, this has been a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I appreciate you.
Bye-bye. Copyright 2025 by Gregg LeFevre. All rights reserved. If you enjoyed this week's episode, let us know. You can find us on Instagram and Facebook at The Compulsive Storyteller, and we'd love to hear from you. This podcast is independently produced, so we really appreciate all your help and support. Share the show with your friends, subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and please leave a review. You can also check out our website, thecompulsivestoryteller.com, for more information. Thanks for listening, and if you didn't like this one, the next one will be another story. The Compulsive Storyteller is now co-produced by Gregg LeFevre and Fadia Montserrat, who's also arranged the music and created the special effects. Emily Ramon does design, research, editing, and marketing. Peter Kokoma has made our theme music and for many seasons co-produced the show with me. All characters and events portrayed in this podcast are based on my truth, with some names and facts changed for privacy. The conversations and dialogues are based on my best memory, but are not word-for-word recreations.